So if you need to get loud, oh, sorry.
Not from the beginning.
Yep. So, okay, that's very loud. So if you need to go to the bathroom, you can find it either out the front here if it's easier for you, down to the end of the building, or you can head inside and up the stairs, and there's a toilet towards the end of the corridor that you can use. The bar is open, and we will have plenty of copies of Reset available for you to purchase afterwards. And Ross has agreed to sign those copies, so we'll be setting up a signing table. So I can see that our Zoom audience is joining us now, so I think that we might get started. So welcome everybody. It's nice to see a few faces coming in on there as well. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all this evening. This is lovely. We've got a really nice full back deck here at Avid Reader, and it's a lovely, cool Brisbane evening. So I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered here, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So to address the Zoom audience quickly, thank you all for joining us. As you are no doubt already aware, you have been placed on mute and you will remain so throughout the evening, but that doesn't mean that we don't want you to be very much a part of this event with us. We certainly do. If you have any questions, please send those through via the chat box. They'll come through to our assistant who is running the live stream room inside, and they'll be texted to me towards the end of the evening so that your questions can be read out along with the audience members' questions tonight. Ross has agreed to sign copies of his book for us, and if you would like to make a purchase and have it signed yourself and you're joining us on the live stream, then you can give us a call on 38463422 and we will take down your name and a personal message if you like, and we can get copies signed for you as well. So when it comes to the questions, yep, type them in the chat box and they will come through to us and we'll make sure that you're included. The last couple of people are heading in here to the venue. So I think I would now like to introduce Ross Garnaut. Ross is the Professorial Research Fellow in Economics at the University of Melbourne. In 2008, he produced the Garnaut Climate Change Review for the Australian government. He is the author of many books, including the best-selling Dog Days and Superpower. And in conversation with Ross tonight, we have Dr. Angela Dean. Angela is a quantitative social scientist. Her research focuses on how to promote environmental citizenship within communities. And so it's now my pleasure to hand over to Angela to take the discussion from there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Ross, for coming to Avid Reader tonight. I don't think you're on.
Oh, sorry. Lovely outdoors Queensland setting.
We can hear. Sing out if you can't. It's fabulous to be at face-to-face events again, but it's also fabulous to have you Zoomers as well. Ross, to get us started, this book is a call to arms for restoring the Australian economy post-pandemic, or coming to the end part of the pandemic, post, hopefully. Can you give us an overview of where the economy was at beforehand, what happened during the pandemic, and why this is such an amazing opportunity we need to see?
Well, the book's called Reset Restoring Australia.
Sorry, can you? It's Hold it like an ice cream instead of down.
Okay, how's that?
No.
Okay, thank you. The book's called Reset Restoring Australia after the Pandemic Recession, not just restoring the Australian economy. The book's about knowledge. In fact, the first chapter is called The Tree of Knowledge. My wife Jane and I escaped from Melbourne as the shutters were coming down in March, and we spent 9 months in the Western Queensland town of Barcaldine, and I gave half a dozen public lectures through the University of Melbourne, from under the tree of knowledge in Barcaldine. And really, that's the core of the book. But the book's about knowledge, about how many people get sick and die during a pandemic depends on knowledge. Whether you have a brief period of economic recession and difficulty, or a long, profound period of economic difficulty after a pandemic depends on economic knowledge. Whether the tensions that are inevitably set up internationally during a big pandemic lead to war and difficult relations among states depends on knowledge. And in that first chapter, I point out that in parts of the world, especially the developed capitalist democracies, there's been a downgrading of the role of knowledge in the 21st century. That democracy and Australia were built on knowledge, on the Enlightenment, respect for knowledge, and that democracies don't really work unless there's respect for knowledge and broadly based understanding of important policy choices. And it's been very hard to maintain that respect in the 21st century for a number of reasons. And it's been hardest in the English-speaking countries, especially the United States, Britain and Australia. I mentioned a number of the reasons for that. And I think one very important reason is the influence of News Corp and the Murdoch media. Another influence that's been very difficult has been the growth in the role of social media, which, and I quote Malcolm Turnbull in a speech he gave in December last year, that the availability of the social media has allowed media organisations to narrowcast, to talk to a particular part of the community and to exclude others, and you no longer need a big audience to maintain a viable business, because the costs of a media outlet that relies on the internet are very low, whereas for a newspaper you have to have everyone reading it to do any good, because the overhead costs were very high. So the narrowcasting means that parts of our community are just talking to each other. It becomes very difficult to break into those set ways of doing things. The countries, the next chapter in the book is about how the pandemic broke and then how countries responded to it. And the countries that did worst were those in which leaders denied medical science. Most importantly, the presidents of the United States and Brazil. Briefly, Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, but after he got COVID himself, he took it seriously. Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil both got COVID themselves and didn't take it seriously. So, and I point out that the experience of the pandemic helped to discredit populism, helped to discredit denial of knowledge. We would probably still have Trump as president of the United States if it wasn't for the pandemic. And he was damaged greatly by the fact that his denial of medical knowledge was seen as having done great damage to the American people. And I point out that we need a similar respect for knowledge, the respect for knowledge that gave successful outcomes in a number of countries from the pandemic. We need that same respect for knowledge to deal with our economic problem after the recession and to deal with other big problems, most importantly climate change. can I keep going for a bit? Do you want
Yeah.
and he seemed ready to.
I was going to jump in because at that point in the book, you actually say that this might be the end of downgrading of knowledge in public policies in capitalist democracies in Western countries such as ours. Do you think that's actually the case?
Well, what I say is that we will soon know whether it's just a temporary or a permanent downgrading of ignorance.
So you're not a gambling man on that one. You wouldn't put money on a direction.
No, but I think that what's happened in the United States is actually very important. It might turn out to be the crucial thing. It's an awful truth, but I think it's the truth that Trump would have been re-elected without COVID, and that would have entrenched the elevation of ignorance in policy making. That would have created a very difficult world. I think it would have ended the chances of the world dealing with climate change. But Biden has come in with such a different view on a whole range of things, and for humanity, most importantly on climate change, and starting with a deep respect for scientific knowledge on climate, a commitment of the US to zero emissions electricity by 2035, zero net emissions by 2050, but also a commitment to making sure that all countries implement similar policies. So the US is now joining on climate, all of the other developed countries of the world except Australia, and joining China in commitment to zero net emissions by the middle of the century. And I think that's a decisive change. So to ask me, am I a betting man? I actually would bet on the world getting this right now. And we might not have got it right if it hadn't been for the destruction of the Trump presidency by the pandemic.
Fabulous is all I'll say to that. There's a chapter in the book about the superpower and the real opportunity Australia has at the moment to foster growth, employment, and tackle climate change in this coupled response. How big is the scale of the opportunity here?
Big enough to make all the difference. I denied earlier that the book's about the economy. A fair bit of it is about the economy. And there's one chapter, Wrong Way, Don't Go Back, about how we had a pretty miserable 7 years for ordinary Australians in the 7 years before the pandemic recession. And we should not want to go back to that. We had the lowest growth in economic output per person in the developed world, lower even than Japan, which we think of as not doing very well. We had no growth in per capita household income during that period. In the lower half of the Australian income distribution, we had decline in real incomes per person. Unemployment just stayed at what I think is an unacceptably high level, around 5.5% right through those 7 years. Whereas in the United States, it started 2 or 3 percentage points higher than us and went down to 3.5%. We just were stuck. And during those 7 years, underemployment rose and rose and rose. By the Bureau of Statistics, you're employed if you worked an hour in the week before the survey. But more and more Australians had an hour's work, but didn't have as many hours of work as they wanted. So they were bad times. We shouldn't want to go back to that. I also say that we couldn't go back to that if we tried. If we just put in place the policies we had, then it'd be much worse after the pandemic for lots of reasons. And so I point out a number of things that we could do to choose post-pandemic restoration of Australia rather than post-pandemic dog days. I call that period 2013 to 2019 the dog days. I wrote a book about it in 2013 saying unless we're careful, we'll have 7 years of dog days. Well, we had the dog days, and we've got a choice now between restoration of Australia and the dog days. And part of getting things right has to be rather strong growth in export industries. I give some of the reasons for that in the book, and a lot of the what had been the best opportunities for growing Australian exports in the 21st century before the recession are no longer available to us. 22% of our exports are coal and LNG, a lot of them coming from up the road in Queensland. Well, they'll actually be declining. Coal will be declining. A lot of leaders say correctly that we'll still be using coal for another 20 or 30 years, but exports will be declining. Gas will not be increasing, and then it will start to decline. So we're not going to get growth there. In fact, we're going to have much faster growth in everything else to make up for that. And our most dynamic export industry during the dog days was education services. And the universities have been crippled financially by the pandemic and being denied access to JobKeeper and other emergency support. So the universities won't be in a position to contribute lots of export growth, taking on fee-paying foreign students. And the problems in the China-Australia relation mean that what had been the most dynamic country of our foreign trade won't be there. And so if you just look at the headwinds, you'd say the prospects are not very good, but they're more than outweighed by the new opportunities that come from the world being committed to zero emissions economic activity. And why that is the case, well, my book Superpower, published at the end of 29, did some of your avid readers read that?
I'm sure you can order it and also get it signed.
Anyway, in Superpower, I pointed out that if the world was going to zero net emissions, that would be a great place for Australia, because we've got by far the richest renewable energy resources in the developed world. And so unless we muck it up, and pretty easy for us to muck things up, but unless we muck things up, we will have the lowest cost energy in the world. And that becomes a huge advantage for industry, especially for processing minerals in the zero emissions world. It's a much bigger advantage than having the world's best coal, which we've got, because we export our coal and it's just as cheap to use in Kobe making steel or Shanghai making steel as it is in Whyalla. In fact, cheaper because it costs more to transport metallurgical coal to Whyalla than to Shanghai or Kobe. So because it is so expensive to transport electricity through transmission lines under the sea, or by turning into hydrogen and exporting hydrogen, the processing of minerals using Australian renewable energy is best done in Australia with a very big margin. So that's potentially a huge industry. Just the processing of Australian exports of iron ore into iron metal accounts for more than 3% of global emissions. Total Australian carbon emissions about 1% of global emissions. So the processing of our iron ore accounts for 3%. Well, we can turn that into zero emissions iron here using renewable energy to make hydrogen, to make iron. And many other opportunities processing minerals. And our other huge advantage, and I've got another chapter about that in here, I've got one about the renewable energy opportunity and the other about the landscape opportunity. We've got far more woodland and other land per person than other countries. And that becomes hugely valuable in the zero emissions world economy. Storing carbon in the soils or in plants, you can export the credits. And in the zero emissions world that we're headed towards, we will be making plastics and other chemical manufactures not out of fossil energy and putting carbon back into the atmosphere, but out of biomass, which is grown by taking carbon from the atmosphere, and then you put it back, but you're not increasing the carbon stock. And we'll have huge advantages in that. So I'm concluding, whereas in Superpower in 2019, I said that there is a very large opportunity in these new industries as the world heads towards zero emissions. now I'm saying, well, two things have changed. One, not only is it a very big chance, it's our only chance because of the headwinds in other areas of our exports. And secondly, the opportunity is much larger because America joining the developed world means that all of our developed country trading partners, plus our biggest trading partner, China, are committed to zero net emissions and will get lots of advantages from trading with us.
The opportunities are amazing, but I want to jump back to mucking it up because sometimes it feels like we're at risk of doing that. So the economic case is enormously compelling for tackling climate change through those types of strategies. And I think a lot of us who are want to see good climate change, we're really hoping that those strong economic cases would broaden the support for carbonisation at a societal scale. And yet our political leaders are still stymieing change and we still feel at times quite stuck and depressed and ending up in the bar. What's the way forward really for meaningful change for Australia? Can we just ignore the federal government and get on with it? Or what opportunities have we really got?
Well, it is a failure of our political system at the federal level. At the state and territory level, it's pretty good. Every state government, every territory government is committed to what the rest of the developed world is committed to.
Can we all secede from the federal government?
Well, I think there are lots of advantages in there being one country, even if it was much better to be in the middle of Queensland than where I normally am during COVID. But there's lots of things that we can do through business action and through state and territory governments. But in truth, we'd go much further and get much more out of it if the Commonwealth government was there as well. So what are the prospects of the Commonwealth government moving? I think there is broadly based community support now for strong action on climate, and it's a peculiarity of our federal political system that's not being reflected in policy. We had in place for a couple of years what at the time was the world's best set of carbon policies when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, and we were due to our carbon pricing system was due to become part of the European system on the 1st of July 2014. But Tony Abbott had abolished it from the 30th of June 2014. So a day before we become part of the international system. If we had that now, then all of these things that we're talking about in Superpower would happen just through the operation of the market. We'd be exporting iron to zero emission iron to Europe and so on. But it's very hard to go back to that quickly. I think we will go back to that in due course, but with the knots of opposition to that, especially a few Queensland seats, a couple of New South Wales seats, Morrison is dependent on those seats for his narrow majority, so he's not going to suddenly change all of that. But nor can he stay where he was. Analogy I sometimes draw to the situation of America taking such a strong position on climate change is that with when General MacArthur went back to the Philippines to kick the Japanese out of the Philippines in 1945. The American troops came in. The Philippines always used to drive on the Australian side of the road, and they had ever since cars had been invented. But American tanks and lorries started coming in, and they only near the American side of the road. And within 30 minutes, the Philippines was driving on the American side of the road. I think that we are just going to get run over if we remain the only developed country that's not part of this. Now, I say, in the words I use in the book is we've got a choice about whether we embrace this zero emissions world, which we're going to join, or whether we slide into it, shuffle sideways like a crab under the ocean. Hugely advantageous for us if we embrace it and really use the opportunity. But like a crab or through our own initiative, we will get there. But if we do it reluctantly, then we won't put in place all the supporting policies that will make the most of it. I think we'll get there now because of what's happened in the international situation, but we'd get much more out of the transition if we move decisively, deliberately and early.
So that strong case in the book for embracing the superpower, for boosting expansion of jobs, that involves industrial expansion as well as expansion export industries. There's a parallel commentary that some of us will be familiar with about the need to consume less, the need to reduce our footprint, either physically in terms of our urban or industrial expansion, or more conceptually about use of resources. So those commentators who talk about degrowth and this increasing tendency to need to consider that, how does that fit with your recommendations, and how does it sit alongside the need to feed people and employ people and still come to bookshops?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by, it's very important to be clear what you mean by growth. For an economist, growth is rise in living standards. And what we've got to do is have rises in living standards. Now, we need good living standards to be healthy and be able to afford all the books we want to enjoy and make the most of life. In developing countries, it's absolutely imperative that living standards rise. There's still lots of poor people in the world, and if they don't have rising incomes, then they're condemned to a life of misery, like all people on earth, except for kings and lords were until a couple of hundred years ago. So we shouldn't reject rise in living standards. What we've got to do is break the nexus between pressure on resources and rising living standards. It's economic growth have improved education and it's economic growth to have improved medical services, neither of which need to lead to greater consumption of fossil energy or even of copper and steel. So the big job is to break the link between economic growth, rising living standards and consumption of finite materials, including amongst the finite materials, all biodiversity, all of the precious elements of the ecosystems that support living things.
And for those on Zoom, there's some biodiversity going on above us at the moment with some bats having a great time. They're queuing up for the signing is what I think they're doing. There's a lot of discussion about the need to bring people with us when people are advocating for change and reform, and yet for a lot of the Australian community on both sides of the political spectrum associate the political rhetoric of looking after the economy or reform as justifying further inequity or justifying poor corporate practices. How do we start to get people excited about some of the complex issues that you present in the book that we need to think about tackling when sometimes the language may create identity barriers for people engaging?
Well, I've done my best in the book to make it readable and compelling.
I didn't mean it wasn't readable.
And then a behavioural scientist like Angie has to do the rest. So I can only do part of the job, Angie, but political leadership has to play an important role. I point out in the book that there have been a number of times in Australian history when we've faced very large problems and we've overcome them. Now, there's certain two outstanding cases of the post-war reconstruction. After the First World War, we had miserable unemployment, economic stagnation when the troops came home. We had a Great Depression starting before the Great Depression began. But after the Second World War, the government established a Department of Post-War Reconstruction the goal of which was to establish for the first time in Australia continuing full employment. That was the period when we committed ourselves to universities playing a big general role in society, not just for a very small elite. That was the time when the social security net was broadened. That was the time when we did have genuine full employment for a quarter of a century. That success was dependent first of all on good economic analysis, on knowledge, and then on political leadership. First, it was committed to equity and to broadly based knowledge, and also to explaining what it was on about to the broad community. So much so that even when you got a change of government from Chifley to Menzies in '49, most of the elements of the post-war reconstruction program remained in place. And in fact, Menzies continued and expanded some of them, like the growth of the universities. And the second period of success that had the same ingredients, similar ingredients, was the Hawke government's reform. Coming on top of 8 years of high unemployment and high inflation and really deep division in society between about 74 and 83. And again, equity is very important in the set of policies. That was the period where we got Medicare, we got family allowances, and very important part of the success was Hawke's public education, bringing the community along, explaining the links between equity and economic reform. Other periods when we faced good problems, big problems, we haven't solved them unless we've had those essential ingredients. Good economic analysis, but also to equity as part of the package of policies, and a leadership committed to explaining what they're on about, public education. And we need all that again. Will we get it again? Well, one point I always like to make is that we live in a democracy, so we can't cop out and say the hopeless government's not implementing what I put in my book. We've got to make it happen. We're free to create community support for policies that suit the restoration of Australia. So we've got to do that, to give governments no choice. And if that democratic process of spreading ideas that have a chance of building a better Australia, if that's successful, then you make it possible for leaders who want to do that to stick their necks out and move things along. And if established parties don't deliver, then there's all sorts of ways of putting pressure on them. So it's up to the best and easiest if there was another John Curtin or Bob Hawke to lead it, but we shouldn't just cop out. We should accept that it's our responsibility in a democracy to make sure that our fellow Australians don't accept miserable outcomes.
That's good to say, but it's easy to say as well, sitting here in a bookshop. What type of meaningful public agitation would persuade the federal government, who at times seem impervious to public view?
Well, you may not persuade them. You may create an atmosphere in which someone else becomes the federal government. I don't think there are very few political leaders who have been successful in democracy who are not capable of responding to a changed political mood. We've seen it in Morrison himself a few times, maybe even on women.
That's for the bar.
We'll wait and see. But governments can change policies, and alternative governments can develop alternative policies.
Can I say in a very respectful way, you've been around for ages and you've seen so much. Like, if you check out Ross's website, it's hardcore. You need a holiday. It's amazing. But you've seen a lot of change, and you would have seen opportunities where people didn't seize the moment for change, where it passed and it was missed. And the common rhetoric, and we had an argument about this at dinner last night, the common rhetoric is the pandemic is the time for change. It's this window of opportunity. And we've seen some things change, but do you think it might happen? What does it smell like? And are you smelling it now? That's
it's not smelling very rosy in Australia, but Australia's only part of the world. What's happening in the United States is historic. I noticed out there Barack Obama's book, The Promised Land, which I read a couple of weeks ago. I think he was a great man, a great president, but he didn't change America that much. His vice president, Biden, even older than me, is actually determined to he's probably only got 4 years. Who would vote for someone who's 82 when they come to office? And maybe that helps. But he's determined very quickly to make huge change. And the United States is going to have genuine full employment in a year or so. On top of those huge expansionary policies to create full employment, he's just introduced another bill that I don't know how many of you know how big $1 trillion is, but he's going to spend 3 of them on infrastructure and the climate transition. Well, an Australian government, if you boil it down to population here, would have to spend about 70 billion a year on that to do something comparable. We would certainly transform Australia with a quarter of that. So, and comparable things in this space are happening in Europe and in Japan and Korea and China. I think that will feed back into a change in what we accept, a change in what we tolerate. If we went back to the dog days and we're stuck at 5% unemployment in America, so 3.5 and 3, or if we're stuck with the climate space we are now, and we're losing all these opportunities, and other countries in the world are grabbing them, if we're pleading with General Motors to keep making dirty cars because they're about to stop them because Americans don't want to buy them, and Europeans and Japanese and Koreans and Chinese don't want to buy dirty cars, they're not going to make dirty cars just for us. This world is. I'm not pessimistic right at the moment about the world as a whole. Sure, there's some huge problems, but let's not flagellate ourselves unnecessarily. This is a moment of history when there are things to be thankful for. Not many of them are in Australia at the moment, but the fact that they're happening in other places will help us to get them in Australia.
a lot of what economists do is about projection and anticipating. And during the fires, the 2008 climate review got cited to say the fires will get worse, especially in 2020. So you've clearly got the eye. But what has surprised you about the current either Australian or global response to the pandemic?
When the pandemic began, I would not have been surprised if the biggest global problem, climate change, had been relegated in priority. And so I won't use the word surprising, but it was improbable that after the pandemic recession, all of the developed countries and China would be much more strongly committed to action than before. I had thought it more likely that the preoccupation with, first of all, the pandemic itself and then the economic problems would mean you'd get a relegation. But that didn't happen. It's really important and a little bit complicated why it didn't happen. I think one of the important things was that it did help to reduce the political standing and influence of leaders who denied knowledge, but most importantly, Trump. Now, I had not anticipated all of that. And just to be clear, it is true that in the climate change review of 2008, I said that the bushfires would become more and more frequent, and this would be evident to our community by 2020. But while I wrote it, I had some very good scientists working with me who had done all the work to show that was true. And what I did was faithfully record and write in better language than they could have written the conclusions that they had been reaching.
Someone who always likes a citation. It's I think it's Lucas et al. Is the citation you have in it. The book isn't just about climate change. There's a whole range of other social, fiscal and monetary policy discussion that you present that's an important part of tackling all of our challenges and that full country restoration, including things like cash flow taxes, universal basic incomes. Can you tell us a little bit about those? And is it possible to make some of these changes in an incremental piecemeal way, or do we really need a threshold type of change to embrace things?
Well, I'm saying that now is the time for two very big changes. One is the change from the standard corporate income tax to cash flow tax. Now this is a bit arcane, and not everyone loves that sort of stuff. I once wrote a whole book about mining tax, and not many of you would want to read it, although
I'm sure you can order it.
That's right, good on you.
She gets a drink.
And I was saying to Andrew earlier that she asked me which is your best book. I've written too many, and I said the one I think is perfect is that one. But the way the cash flow tax works is you allow companies that are investing to immediately write off all of their capital expenditure, but you don't give them any deduction for interest payments. You don't give them any deduction for payment for intellectual property they're purchasing from overseas, unless they can show that that the particular intellectual property the taxpayer is getting a deduction for was developed for the taxpayer. And so we would remove the two biggest sources of tax evasion in Australia, and they're huge. We spend a lot of our incomes these days on information technology platforms. The cost of producing those services for all of us trivially low, so it's all pure profit. But that income is completely cancelled as far as the tax office is concerned, because the IT companies are charged for intellectual property that happens to be about the same as their revenue. So they've got no taxable income in Australia. And the intellectual property rights are held in a tax haven where they pay no tax, don't even pay tax in their home country, America. So there's a set of problems that I think the cash flow tax will deal with. It would provide a very big incentive for companies that are investing now, and would tax more heavily those who are resting on their laurels. It would support innovation, it would support new companies, it would support companies taking a risk with investment in research and development, and would place a higher burden on those that were earning economic rent and living on past investment. So you could do this at any time, very difficult to do incrementally, except that to put this in place would cost about $50 billion in the first year. You get it back and more later on, but the very first impact is a negative effect. And now, when the government's just run a deficit of 156 billion is the revised number, then 50 billion is manageable. We could do that instead of giving Crown Casino JobKeeper. And so from that point of view, it fits the requirements of the moment, and in other circumstances it might not be so easy. Similarly, the minimum basic income, I call it Australian income security because it's politically coloured. If it's called a minimum basic income, it's favoured by people who want more equity in income distribution, and therefore it's hated by people who don't. But Milton Friedman came up with the same idea, and he thought it was a great way of promoting the market. He called it negative income tax. Well, I want to get away from negative income tax as a label and get away from minimum basic income. So I call it Australian income security. And the basic idea is everyone would get paid into everyone except those with high incomes or a lot of wealth would get paid into their bank account every fortnight, a payment equal to the unemployment benefit. And that would not be withdrawn as income, like Social Security payments, as income reached some threshold. At the moment, someone on Social Security, whether it's an old age pension or a disability pension, loses a very large amount of that once their income exceeds some relatively small amount. And so there's usually a threshold at which it's really not worth financially the time of someone increasing their hours of work. It's one of the reasons we've got such a large part of our labour force only minimum amount of only working for a minimum number of hours. And the advantage of this is it become an income supplement for those on very low incomes, including part-time workers, and it would remove the poverty trap, so it would remove the disincentives for labour force participation. Like the cash flow tax, it cost a lot to introduce, maybe 40 billion. But you don't, unlike the cash flow tax, you don't get it back and more later on, but you get a lot of it back later on. And so as the disincentive to employment is removed, people are working longer hours. And as we get back to full employment, and other parts of my package will give us full employment, then from the same population, we get a few percent more hours worked. And the tax on that ends up paying for a substantial part, not all, but a substantial part. So just like the cash flow tax, it's easier to introduce now when we need a lot of stimulus in the economy than it is in more normal times. So now is the time to make that sort of change. It will be much more difficult at other times.
Now, I've got a zillion more questions for Ross, and we could clearly chat for hours, but I suspect it's time to hand over to questions to the audience. Do you want me to run those in the cake, or do you? Oh, okay, you can run around. Okay.
Yeah, so, okay, well, I can see two right here.
Ross, the net debt of Australian Commonwealth and state governments will go to 1.4 trillion by 2024. That excludes borrowings by local government. In the midst of that, we've got Jerry Norman that's just made a $2.9 billion profit on the back of $2.2 million from JobKeeper. When I talk to my son who's 30 and I'm in my 60s about net debt, he says, my major issue is climate change debt, it's not net debt. How have you addressed the issue of net debt, and what's the impact on how governments deal with net debt and how they manage climate change?
I talk a lot about that. In fact, I've got one chapter called An Eye-Watering Amount of Debt. Because you might recall Josh Frydenberg used that expression when he announced that package at the end of last March. While we've got lots of unemployment, we should not be concerned about debt, and we should not be concerned about debt funded by the exchange of cash for securities by our central bank. We do have to be concerned about it as we approach full employment. But the more that the debt has been funded by the central bank is part of our public sector, and it's not the same, for example, as debt held by foreigners, which does require a reduction of the Australian standard of living when you're repaying it. But it's a big issue, and the role of debt is, and the cost of and problem of debt is very different in a world in which there are surplus savings and in which long-term capital markets are generating low, around zero net interest, real interest rates. So in current circumstances, I don't think it was a mistake for the federal government to enter into by far the biggest deficits in Australian history. Last year's was the biggest in Australian history as a share of the economy. This one's nearly twice as big. I say in the book, Don Bradman's never stood so far above his peers as this year's deficit. But the important thing is to have in place mechanisms that allow us to haul that back when we get to full employment. And if we handle all that well, it will be manageable. What will be unmanageable is if we weren't hauling it back at full employment.
Ross, you started your conversation talking about broadcasting to narrowcasting, and I see that with the algorithms and AI, that what I read online is shaped by what I look at. What do you recommend for the average person like me, how we can go broad again, and what do you do?
When social media first came, Facebook, Twitter and all that stuff, I resolved never to use it because I thought it would damage knowledge and damage our democracy. And I've never, ever used it, which is not a complete protection. After my second climate change review, Jane and I desperately needed a break because that was a pretty harrowing time with Tony Abbott on my tails. And then the astroturfing, every time I opened my mouth, there'd be tens of thousands of immediate emails saying what a rotter I was, threatening to kill me in the streets, with my secretary and my grandchildren if I didn't shut up. So we had a holiday in Morocco, and a friend of mine, a professor of economics at the University of Adelaide, rang me. He didn't know I was overseas, and so didn't know it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And said, Ross, I can't believe that you've changed your views on immigration. I said, I haven't changed my views on immigration. He said, yes, I have. Yes, you have. I said, no, I haven't. He said, I follow you on Facebook. I said, I'm not on Facebook. He said, yes, you are. And you've got 69,000 followers. And after a while, he came to accept that I wasn't on Facebook, that someone had impersonated me, unfortunately impersonated me. So I rang up the federal police and said, I've been fraudulently impersonated. Please stop it and make sure they pay the proper penalty for their crime. And he said, no, it's not illegal. So it is a really difficult area. I was never on Facebook myself and have never been, but that didn't protect me completely. It didn't protect me from abuse by others, but it did protect me from wasting my time on focusing on irrelevant things and having my reading content dictated by an algorithm from Zuckerberg. I should say at the end of the story that what the federal police were terrific. And they said, well, it's not illegal, we can't arrest them, but we can stop them, but we can ring up the company and say that this is really bad, and the Australian Federal Police thinks it's a really bad thing, and ask them to have it taken down. And that actually worked, but it depended on the goodwill of the company, and it wasn't taken down as a matter of law.
All right, I've got a couple more questions.
What are your views on modern monetary theory?
Got a bit of that in the book. I think some parts of it are sound, but they're not modern. There's nothing in that part of it that wasn't in John Maynard Keynes in 1936, or John Maynard Keynes in his general theory, or in John Maynard Keynes' treatise on money in 1923. There are other things that I don't think are sound, and they are modern. I think that the sound bits of it really relate very much to the answer I gave over here, that when you've got unemployment, then you can fund a deficit through the Reserve Bank expanding the money supply. That's actually a good thing, the right thing to do. I'm very critical of our Reserve Bank in this book. I say that they're responsible for unemployment being an average of several 100,000 higher than it needed to be during the dog days. But I don't know if it's because they were listening to the lectures on which this was based and then read the book. But in the last few weeks, there's been a radical change in the Reserve Bank's position. And I think they've got it right now, and they are effectively funding the Commonwealth deficit and some of the state deficits by buying government securities and crediting the accounts of the banks to pay for them.
As a scientist, I love the idea of return to respect for knowledge, especially scientific knowledge. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there are really strong currents in society that question, for better and worse, perceived wisdom and authority. So is it possible that we can carve out a distinguished space for scientific knowledge or scientific authority from other kinds of authority?
Respect for knowledge was very important in our society for a long period. And a political leader who let themselves be associated with ignorance paid a penalty. Now that hasn't been so clearly the case recently, especially in the English-speaking countries. I think it's worse in the English-speaking, especially in the United States, to a lesser extent UK and Australia than in the rest of the world. No, I don't think there will be a privileging of scientific knowledge. I think that if we're going to restore respect for knowledge, it will be respect for knowledge more broadly. I've already mentioned how political leaders who were strongly attached to ignorance and denial of knowledge did badly during the pandemic recession. I've already said that we have to wait and see whether that's a temporary or a long-term thing. I think this is one of the really big questions, and I don't know the answer better than anyone else, but there's no question more important than this one to the future health of our democracy and more generally of our species.
Thank you. So we have time for one last question.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm just wondering, we can have the best scientific or economic knowledge in the world, you can have the best modelling and so on, but it doesn't obviously it doesn't necessarily impact on politics. You've got the minerals councils and you've got the Murdoch media and so on. I'm just wondering, from your vast and broad experience, what kind of strategies have actually worked on governments who wouldn't ordinarily accept, the best kind of, economic or scientific knowledge that's available?
She's asking you to tell us about talking to Tony Abbott.
That too, but there's a bunch of them, I think.
Right.
It takes two to talk, and he didn't particularly want to talk to me. I think the most powerful things would be first to deny, to make it illegal for any payments to be made for political parties or campaigns, except by individuals up to a limit.
Like in Germany.
Lots of countries have it. We are the most open to the influence of money. We have fewer constraints than any other democracy. That's wrong. That makes us very vulnerable. And the money that Palmer spent we wouldn't have had the result in the last election if it hadn't been for the $80 million that Palmer spent, and most influential in the two places he concentrated on, Queensland and West Australia. Really important. I would limit donations to individual donations, and then of course you not only have to limit it to political parties, but to limited political type campaigns more generally. The second thing I do is I would fund through the budget some financial support for public interest media. We've got a definition of what public service media is. One of the few lasting things that Nick Xenophon left in his brief meteoric passage across the night sky was some fiscal support for rural and provincial media who are engaged in public interest broadcast media journalism, and that's one definition. We might be able to improve it a little bit, but it doesn't mean support for public interest is not determined by the number of people who read it. The criteria have to go beyond that, but up to some limit per organisation, and in each region. If we had that sort of support, then media outlets would be able to employ more quality journalists to dig deep enough to get to the truth of things. One of the really dangerous developments in our democracy has been the reduction in the quality of our best newspapers, and that's because they no longer have the income that they used to have. Most of their advertising revenue is now taken by the internet platforms, and I think the best way to allow a serious media to play their essential role in the promulgation of knowledge and correction of falsehood is to provide public support for public interest journalism.
Thank you, Ross. This has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. As you said earlier, Angela, we could certainly continue to talk for much longer, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So would you please all join me in thanking Ross? Very much, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you to everybody who tuned in on Zoom. Don't forget that you can call in if you would like copies of books signed by Ross as well. We are now going to all head in to the signing table, but if you wouldn't all mind, if you are with us in real life in person, please just remain seated for a moment. We'll get Ross and Angela inside so that we can get the signing table set up, and then you are all welcome to join us indoors.
And happy birthday, Phil.
Thank you, everybody.